Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Everyday Anarchism, the show about how you are always surrounded by anarchism, cooperation, mutual aid, and non domination. I am your host, Graham Culbertson. I've had in the back of my mind to create a series on anarchist pilgrimages. And I've been talking to some friends who are tour guides in Europe about it, but then I read an article by Dave Zirin in The Nation. He and his friend Mike have already done an anarchist pilgrimage to Barcelona. So, while I will still get this series off the ground at some point, consider this a little prologue. I interviewed Dave and Mike about their trip, what they saw, and how you, yes, you, can go to Barcelona and see its radical history.
By all means, everyday anarchism. Let's do this thing.
Okay, so I was thinking about a way to frame this, and I just realized when we tour, when we go places, we tend to do the like great man of history, kings and emperors bullshit. If you go to Paris, it's all arcs of triumph, it's all Versailles palaces, it's all here's the shit Napoleon stole from Egypt. Our travel is like we're trying to relive some imperial glorious past. And now it's okay because France is a democracy or something, and we can still just worship at the altars of kings and emperors. So I've been thinking about why is it that those of us who supposedly want to resist this idea of history and this narrative and these great men and their bloody, monstrous imperial conquests, why do we go worship at their shrines to themselves? That's even what the pyramids are, built by slaves. And I've been thinking about setting up for people anarchist or radical tours. I mean, not an actual tour that we do, but just the idea of if they want to go somewhere like Paris, not do the great man version, do the revolutionary, do the anarchist version. And then my guests today, it turns out, have already done a trip like that. I read an article about Barcelona by Dave Zirin, where Dave and his buddy Mike went and did the radical tour of Barcelona. So I asked you two on the show to tell me about it. So I guess tell us who you are and then tell us about this trip.
My name is Dave Zirin. I'm a sports writer at The Nation magazine, and Mike's amazing daughter Emma is going to school in Barcelona. He asked me if I wanted to tag along as he was going to visit her, and the opportunity to go to Barcelona, a city I'd only read about in books, and to examine the 1930s history. It was just too tempting an offer to pass up.
So, Mike, I guess
Oh,
you don't tell us about your daughter. Tell us about the trip, though.
yeah. So it was a great opportunity that just kind of fell into my lap. Yeah, my daughter was doing a semester in Barcelona, and so and kind of like Dave, like I'd read Homage to Catalonia, like I don't know, maybe like 20 years ago, but it really kind of like was in some ways life altering, especially when Orwell goes through the descriptions of what revolutionary Barcelona looked like. It just kind of opened up for me the idea of another kind of world being possible. And since then, like certainly those kinds of examples of kind of reading more radical history, but this kind of hidden history. So, but I've always kind of had Barcelona as like one of these like kind of like sacred places that I wanted to check out, wanted to kind of just imbibe that sense of history and sense of possibility by going to that physical space. This opportunity came. My daughter provided the thin excuse, and my buddy Dave along with me. And yeah, so
Yeah, so for those of you who don't know, Homage to Catalonia is this amazing book by George Orwell. I will do a whole episode on it in the show, in which Orwell went and fought in the Spanish Civil War. And if you're like me, and your knowledge of the Spanish Civil War was high school level, which was there was a Spanish Civil War, and there were Nazis and like some good guys, and the good guys lost. Well, Orwell will tell you that the good guys included both some true, beautiful revolutionary radicals and some Stalinists, and the Stalinists won. And so what it ends up is a battle between fascists and Stalinists, and people like Orwell got run out of the country. So, Dave, I think in your article you mentioned that they don't talk about that much in the official history in Barcelona. I think the narrative in Barcelona is still like, we fought the good fight against the fascists, not so much of we took machine guns from Stalin and used them to shoot anarchists.
I don't know. I think the narrative in Barcelona, and Mike, absolutely say if you disagree, sometimes felt a little bit like a blank slate.
Mm.
Or if not a blank slate, it's like trying to find the history in an antique shop where you're going through all kinds of knickknacks, some of which are pure unadulterated crap. And then all of a sudden you stumble upon an incredibly important morsel of history. And I think it's kind of an object lesson for our side about what happens when you lose.
Mm.
And in that respect, it's an incredible opportunity. I mean, for people, it's like, look, come to this city and learn about what happens when our side has a chance to sit in the saddle, to use Orwell's words, and we lose. And because of that, the history just Mike can give some great examples of this. Like the history is just it's there, but it's certainly not there in a way that would make you feel like this city was defined by perhaps the most important battle of the 20th century.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I remember kind of actually asking my daughter over phone calls prior to the trip about just like, well, have you had any opportunities? Because I lent her the book Homage to Clown before she went. She read most of it and was like inspired, and then tried to talk to some of her professors about it, and they, and she, these weren't history professors, but they, they really didn't have anything to offer her. And then I was like, well, I guess that kind of makes sense. Like our side, broadly speaking, lost. And it's not like going like if you go. I had the opportunity years ago to go to Dublin. And you go to Dublin, and you go in front of the post office, and there's like a big statue of Jim Larkin, an IWW organizer, and hero in the American labor movement, as well as in the Easter uprising, and or James Connolly, or these revolutionary figures. They have statues because our side, broadly speaking, won. And then even and of course you can divide up like the various types of Irish Republicans, but certainly leftists, socialists, anarchists, you can find your heroes in that mix because they, in a broad sense, won. You go to Barcelona, our side, broadly speaking, did not win and actually got lined up and slaughtered. And all the history was repressed until Franco died in 1975. And so the reemergence is really kind of interesting, but it's not a full blown. There's lots of examples. I don't want to hog all the time here. But.
I guess go ahead, Dave.
Jump in. It is so interesting because I studied in Chile as a student, and our side, of course, lost in Chile too. Was drowned in blood thanks to Pinochet. But maybe because the country was emerging from Pinochet's dictatorship, you start to see monuments to the disappeared. You start to see, certainly not in the way that I would want to see, but you start seeing a kind of public recognition and reckoning with the tens of thousands of people who were killed, with the thousands who were tortured. And it's really impossible to navigate Chilean society unless you have a sense of that history. And I mean, even the recent elections that just took place were incredibly political and polarized. And the right wing candidate was really running on a Pinochet restoration plank.
Mm.
And the person running opposite him was a student leader in the mass protests that directly hearkened to the struggles in Chile in the late 60s and early 70s, and really the unfinished efforts to create a country that was outside the thrall of neoliberal capitalism. So very, very interesting in that regard, that in Barcelona, far from trying to reckon with that history, you almost feel a little bit like the history of the city started with the 92 Olympics or something. And like
I
that's
think it's the buildings of Gaudi, and then the 92 Olympics are the next things that happened in Barcelona.
yes. Yeah, and Mike can tell you all about like Gaudi everywhere, which is beautiful. But I also want to see monuments to revolutionaries in certain places, and I want it to tell the history of the place. The one example I want to give that's particularly galling to me is there's this amazing Pablo Picasso museum except they're none of his works from the 30s are in the museum. It literally skips over. And of course, his most famous piece is probably in his life was Guernica. And I asked, like, where's Guernica? And this is Barcelona, where Picasso lived, where the struggle so inspired him. And they keep it in Madrid and lend it out. And there's something even weird about it being Madrid, which is, of course, the cradle of Franco and fascism. Something about that just rang very, very wrong. Like it, almost like white Western settlers who would capture like Native American doodads and have them as artifacts in their home, and they would say, "Oh, we're doing this to honor Native American culture," and it's like, dude, you stole that shit.
Well, I think, Dave, I think the Madrid narrative is that all that stuff is in the past. I mean, this is maybe also similar to the white Western narrative, is that stuff is in the past, and Barcelona is Spain, and Madrid is Spain, and Picasso is Spain, and Guernica is Spain, and don't look behind the curtain to see these cracks. Everything is Spain, and Spain is Spain, and that is great, which if you talk to Catalonians for 5 minutes, they do not feel that way.
And Mike, I want to get this right. So, Mike, am I right about this? Because I've been to Dublin too, but it's been a long time. I know that they still have bullet holes from the Easter Rising in the walls that they don't fix on purpose.
Right.
But are there also monuments that explain the bullet holes and why they're there?
You can go into the post office. If I recall, it's been a while, but if I recall, you go into the post office and there are like signs on the wall in the post office talking about why why that's a significant location. You go to Barcelona, for instance, and the big telephone exchange, which was also like one of the anarchist controlled like centers of power. And it's just an office building. I mean, it's this beautiful building, but there's not that I could tell. I couldn't see anything that acknowledges that that its role as a point of whatever, a pivot point, I suppose, in the Spanish Civil War and the history of it. And yeah, that might be whether that's like I was saying, the fact that the fascists won, or the painful history that you were talking about, Graham, earlier about the infighting in the left between the communists and the anarchists and the CNT, and that difficulty. Because one of the folks who did talk to in Spain said that this literally is a country where there are unearthed mass graves. There's been some excavations, some science, but really there are also places where I think what they said was like the police know that, oh, you find a body that an old body there, that's not a crime. You don't investigate that. That's what that's part of history that we don't want to deal with quite yet. And what was the other quote I remember? Somebody saying, they'll deal with the Civil War once the last living participant has died. Which is that's a pretty strong statement. So yeah, we don't have like a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that comes out, in 75, I guess, when Franco dies. You don't have that kind of process at all.
Yeah, I think picking up on that, Mike and Dave, you mentioned this earlier. It's easy for Americans to forget, especially Americans who are younger, who didn't live through the Franco era, that Spain was a fascist country throughout the 30 years after World War II. And so when we think like, oh, well, why didn't they reckon with this after the war was over and all the fascists were defeated? Well, the fascists were never defeated in Spain. They just ruled until Franco died. And so in 75, no one's going to be like, now it's time to talk about 1937. Like, that's not top of mind for them in 1975. We need to get 1937 straight. And I'm guessing that's a huge part of it.
Yeah.
From what I understand, that period in 1975, of course, you're dealing with a country that largely didn't live through the 1930s as much as a country that was just exhausted by the isolation and gray conformity that was the Franco era. I know Mike knows this story because we tell it to death, and if I get it wrong, Mike, let me know. But famously, when David Lean was filming Dr. Zhivago, there was a protest scene. Was it in Barcelona, Mike? or was it in a different city? I don't remember where in Spain he filmed the protest, but the point is that, it was done with actors and extras but when people saw that there was an actual protest in the streets, they thought Franco had died.
I
And
think they were singing the International.
they started
And so
singing
they,
the International and
the
streaming.
extras were singing the International, and people poured out of the street thinking Franco had died. Yeah, that's the story I heard. Yeah,
I didn't know that story.
Oh,
That's wonderful.
this
the
desperate need to get
1960s,
beyond
right?
it. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. So this desperate need to get beyond it existed in 75. It just makes me respect all the more, and also the fact that Franco died and wasn't overthrown. I think that's huge difference. Like apartheid was overthrown,
Mhm.
and the first thing that people did after apartheid was overthrown was say, you know what, the constitution that we had was an apartheid constitution. Let's take a couple of years and write a new constitution. Like compare and contrast that even with the end of the Civil War in this country,
Mhm.
and saying like, wow, we had a slaver's constitution. We need a new constitution for a free society. They didn't do that. They tinkered around the edges, and we're still suffering for it to this day.
Yeah, for sure. Although,
It's
I mean, we shouldn't sell the resistance short, as I understand, and I'll know about the details, but Franco's hand-picked number two was blown up a few years earlier. They planted a bomb on, on his car route to church and sent him into orbit, as they say. I think might have been like the Basque, separatists, but it was like a resistance group blew him up. So that's part of the reason why there was no one to hand power to in 75 in a way. And also you have this thing where like the Western complicits in propping up Franco, not only did the US like what make up, put I guess what the Sixth Fleet, at harbor in Barcelona, during Franco, doing business with them. But like even before the Republic was completely destroyed, when Barcelona failed the next day, Madrid is still in the hands of the Republicans. The country is still, still divided. Although the Republican army was definitely broken at that point with the loss of Barcelona. But Britain, the day after Barcelona falls, they recognize Franco as the head of state. Britain and I think France too. And then France, even though they were, I guess, somewhat friendly to the Republicans, their treatment of the fleeing populations out of Catalonia, out of Barcelona, and and in fact keeping them in refugee camps until eventually the Germans invade, and then they hand them over to the Nazis. Like except for those that were able to escape, like because of Pablo Neruda, and they go to Chile and other places, but or Mexico if they can. But the fact that the West's hands are so dirty with it too, is something that I guess we, when I say the West, I mean, the Allies, whatever, the U.S., England, France, they're completely dirty in this thing too. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's right. So when if you want to put it this way, there's these three sides in the Spanish Civil War, right? There's the fascists, and the fascists come and support them, and then there are these revolutionary anarchists who, Orwell goes and supports, and then there's the communists, and the communists eventually throw in their lot with Stalin. But it seems like the anarchists and the communists are willing to work together and are willing to take help from anyone who is not the fascists, and preferably also not Stalin. And every other government in the world says, yeah, we're not going to take the anti-fascist side. I don't want to draw equivalences between the Western democracies and the fascists or the Stalinists. I'm not so far gone down the left wing that I do not prefer a nice liberal democracy to Stalinist Russia. But if you have this sense that, France and Britain and America are the good guys somewhere deep down, well, they had a chance to show it in Spain, possibly could have even headed World War II off. And they completely abandoned. And the person who was willing to come was Stalin. And that's how it turns out how it did.
And, we have the heroic attempt, which is, I think, sometimes easy to look back on critically, of the POUM, which stands for the Workers' Party of Marxist Unification, an effort to bring together a Trotskyist group with a opposition group called the Workers and Peasants Bloc. and then there was Stalinist repression.
Yeah, the anarchists are willing to throw in their lot with them as well. It does seem like a
Yeah.
coalition could have formed, and boy, could they have used some British or American machine guns.
Yeah, and the story of Stalinism undermining movements outside of Russia for revolutionary purposes, and we could do a whole separate
Yeah,
podcast about
I
that.
agree. I agree.
Be very disturbed.
I think it's worth saying though. I mean, and I totally agree with that assessment. I think it's worth saying that the decisions. I mean, these same kinds of politics play out daily, because it's one thing to kind of like call say the Stalinists were like, you know, these like whatever monsters, but they're echoing what a lot of like moderate leftists and Democratic Party people who, you know, whatever, I count among my friends and allies in so many, you know, specifics, in terms of like various kinds of issues and struggles. But at the same time, it's like the kind of, you know, tendency towards pragmatism, the idea that, oh yeah, we need to drop the radical stuff, and make the movement and make the resistance, you know, respectable, and so that we won't scare England, that we won't scare, you know, France, that we can get aid from. And if we only just tamp that down, then we can, you know. And that was the charge. The Stalinists blocking with some of the moderate Republicans were saying, yeah, let's get rid of this, you know, the radical edges of this thing and sell this thing to the West. And if we'll just everybody can get in line, then we'll get the guns and arms we need to resist fascism. And we'll, you know, if we play nice. And that whole kind of notion that like if we just discipline the radicals, get them in line, then somehow that's the best way of resisting the right is something that plays out time and time again. In all kinds of politics, whether it's just like anti-fascist protests even today, the center is really the thing. And then of course the reality, of course, is just the opposite. You know, you defang and take away the fighting, you know, core and then heart of the resistance. Then what you get is you just open the door for the right even more. You don't get the center, you get the right.
I think Mike and I both wanted, when we went to Barcelona, a kind of celebration of the best of that tradition. And I think we found it. But to be frank, we found it because we paid a tour guide who was an expert at finding it for us, which meant going into, like I mentioned earlier, used bookshops, memorabilia stores. Mike and I on our own found radical bookshops that we went to. And it's just, you need someone to be able to show you where the goods are.
Right.
And
one of the bookshops we went to was the CNT bookshop, and there you'll find a group of people who are trying to preserve and elevate that tradition. So I don't want to act like it's not, you know, people aren't there fighting for that tradition. There are, but sorry, Dave.
Oh no, that's right. And I would just recommend for people to try to seek out some local leftists to be able to show what's up. You know, I mean, Mike and I live in the DC area, and it's not altogether dissimilar. It's more extreme in DC without question, but people come to DC and they want to see these monuments to empire. And yet there's this whole other DC, which has this incredible fighting tradition, but is it really marked in a way like, you know, you can take radical tours of Greenwich Village, you can take radical tours of, you know, the Soho neighborhood in London where Marx lived, and it's like you don't quite. We need to get that in every city, I think.
I don't think I've yet met someone who has been to the Frederick Douglass house besides me in Anacostia. It's
amazing. It's amazing,
Yeah.
the Frederick Douglass house, and
Yeah.
it's like we should put together our own radical tour site. Because I'll tell you something, a place that did have a radical tour that I went to was in New Orleans.
Ooh.
It was freaking amazing, because New Orleans is a place where if you go on the official tour, shit, you might as well, you know, get a lease to a plantation when you're done. They talk about the history of racism and violence as if, you know, oh, it was just cultures coming together, and guess what? We made jazz. You know? as if it's a feel-good after-school story. And when you get somebody who's got some expertise, and of course, yeah, these folks should be paid for their labor, you know, like in showing you this other side of a city and the places that mean something to the residents. I mean, that is a powerful traveling experience. And you know, when I was writing the article for The Nation, and certainly when I was with Mike in the streets of Barcelona, it really made me think about like 19th century travel writing and how that's how people learned about other cities is, you know, writers would just be like, yo, I went somewhere. This is what I saw. And I think we can apply that to radical politics in a way that fills a vacuum, in a way, just sort of generic writing about a city. People would be like, you know, what the fuck? Why do I'll go to Wikipedia. Why do I care?
Yeah. Look, I mean, Dave, that's my, I don't have plans for a website because I don't have time for a website, but that's my plan is to do a series of podcasts, find these guides. I've got some leads and unspool a tour that someone could do. And then also, you know, you get the guide's name out there. And if people want to actually do it, they can email that person and hire them. That's the dream. But I started with you two because you've already done it. So I guess now I want to say before we go on too much longer, what did you see in Barcelona? So you mentioned the CNT bookstore. Do you want to tell us more about that or something else you would like to share so people can visualize this trip? Well, visualize it, even though this is a radio podcast show.
Yeah, so the CNT is a famous anarchist-led trade union, syndicalist trade, type trade union in Spain. They I think kind of like the IWW in the United States. My impression is I could be wrong, but they, while they maintain like an organization and a history and some organizing, they're more kind of like they more preserve the legacy than are actually force in Spanish society. But the legacy that they do preserve is the amazing, rich, and an important one. You go to their bookstore in Barcelona, and I just went and wanted to buy all the posters. They have these like beautiful reproduction, very affordable posters of the Spanish Civil War, and I'm sure it seemed like from the staff there, because my Spanish isn't the best. Dave's actually Spanish is great, but it's Catalan, probably has something to be desired. I think the woman that was there had just opened the store, was a little busy and a little bit kind of like, yeah, okay, another bunch of tourists that are coming in. But then when she, through the course of things, she realized that we were, I think it was when we wanted to buy the newspapers, and Dave said for solidarity, we just want to support you guys. Then her attitude changed immediately, and she recognized us as comrades, and then started to treat and chat with us a lot more indulgently, which I thought was kind of an interesting kind of like maybe just the stream of history buffs that kind of go through there, that she's kind of used to, as opposed to genuine sympathizers. So, but that there was that. I don't know. Was there another? There was the list of places. Why don't you mention some of your favorite places, Dave?
Well, I mean, I think that there's this main shopping area that's pretty much always packed called the Ramblas. And the way it operates is just like this massive promenade that goes on for, I think, a little over a mile. And it's got, some tourist stuff around and some FC Barcelona shops and stuff like that. But the Ramblas are also where you had some of the most fierce fighting in the Spanish Civil War. And we had a guide who was telling us like, okay, this building is where this happened. Here's where Orwell did that. He was a guide who I found through a writer for the Washington Post who used him. And he specifically does radical Spain, radical Barcelona tours. And it was just this like an appreciator and a collector to the extreme, I guess is how I would describe him. And he's an older chap, British. And I think for me, walking on the Ramblas and seeing all the people there in a state of kind of shopping euphoria, and knowing that this was contested space for the working class, like that was pretty emotional for me, especially because so many of the buildings have retained their integrity. They're just doing different things than maybe they would in a more equitable and sane society.
Yeah, so if you've been to Barcelona, you have been to Las Ramblas. So this maybe is less about seeing it, but more about seeing it again. And actually, I'm doing it right now in my head because I'm imagining, I've seen it deserted because I've been on it at like 5 a.m. because of jet lag. and I'm imagining it deserted, and then I'm imagining barricades and gunfighting on it, and I can see that in my head, but I couldn't if I hadn't walked down Las Ramblas. So I would recommend, if you've been to Spain, close your eyes and visualize Las Ramblas, and then Photoshop out the tourists, and Photoshop in whatever you have seen of World War I or World War II, street fighting, and then remember that that's what the soul of Spain, and in some ways the soul of Western Europe, was fought over on that street. And there is no that I have ever seen, no plaque, no remembrance. There's certainly no big monument. On this day in 1930, whatever, people died to keep Spain free. There's just tchotchkes.
Yeah.
To be clear, you said tchotchke, not Trotsky.
Yes. Yes.
Basically
Not Trotsky. Very different.
Yeah, tchotchkes. I'll just say one thing Mike and I did, though, that I'll also recommend for people of our shared radical bent is we started by taking one of those cheesy bus tours of the city where you just sit on the bus and drive around, because it was kind of cool to try to see the city through the eyes of the 1930s. Like, okay, here's where the hills are. Here's where the beach is. And just thinking to yourself, this is all contested, was all contested terrain. And they had to strategize with the topography of this beautiful city. I mean, it's good to get that eagle's eye view before you start getting in the weeds.
Yeah, so you're placing mortars and sandbags. Is that what you're telling me, Dave, in your head?
I was doing a lot in my head, man. Let me tell you, when you're in that kind of sacred space, after reading about it for over half my life, it was pretty emotional. Yeah.
Yeah, the well, looking at the river and thinking about the Battle of Erebo, or going to Montjuic, which is the big mountain in the center of the city, and seeing the citadel at the top of it. And actually, that was another case where, the citadel was both a site of a Republican resistance, but also became a notorious prison camp, and where also mass torture and executions took place for years. And taking the cable car up to the top of that, which was actually its own kind of really fun kind of thing. But getting up there, and it was also, when we went there, it was like pouring rain, so we're the only idiots out there, whatever, getting soaked as we're just wandering around the citadel and looking at it. But there's just this tiny little plaque that basically says, at this location in these moats, this is where the president of Catalonia, Companys, was executed, along with comrades. And just kind of look, okay, so this is where, looking down on this northern moat, this is where they were executing Republicans. And just realizing, just getting a sense of, and maybe this is I tend to be a little bit nostalgic this way, but this sense of this is a sacred space, right? This is where people's lives were lost, in defense of our future. Little bit like actually going to the site of the Commune in Paris, the same kind of thing, which I've had the opportunity to do.
If you're gonna have a tradition, I think, Mike, if you're gonna have a radical tradition, an anarchist tradition, you need sites of remembrance and you need rituals. And I don't think the Communards Wall is all I can think of right now. We don't have these spaces. Like I said, we're touring the same imperialist monuments that everyone else is touring, and we need to change that. We need to remember. One of the big narratives about anarchism is it can't ever work, and the fact of the matter is, it's worked a few times. Paris and Barcelona being the biggest ones, and then those guys were I shouldn't say guys, because women were involved like they weren't in any other revolutionary movement. Those people were murdered. So when people say, oh, it can't work, it's because it has been forgotten that it was working and they were murdered. And yeah, I think those can be sacred sites of remembrance. Absolutely. They should be.
And back to what you were saying in terms of the whole bigger concept of radical tours, it's the idea that resistance has gone on. As long as you've had a working class, you've had resistance, and that this hidden history is everywhere. And of course, when you have those moments of but our side won for a while, it becomes especially memorable. These pitch points, but whether it's going to Ludlow, Colorado, or any number like Wounded Knee, or any number of sites in the Americas of both resistance and tragic defeat. It's like these are sacred spaces. These are spaces where indigenous resistance, where slave resistance, where working class resistance did go. Minneapolis, or Seattle. They're everywhere. You were talking about the Frederick Douglass House in D.C. That's a great spot. But if you go even to like the touristy DuPont area, you would know that the Black Panther Party DC headquarters was in DuPont Circle at that time, right? Until unless somebody has actually done that research and taken you on the tour. Like you go down by Union Station, the train station. The place where I guess they still have the big Columbus statue. There are sites where there was armed self-defense of Black workers during the 1919, I guess, white supremacist race riots. So those sites of resistance are everywhere. But recognizing them, paying honor to them, so yeah, it's really important.
Word up. And it would be great if there were easily accessible guides in every city, because this is an every city issue. I mean, we've all got the cities that have shown out in history, but we also know a lot of this history gets memory hold too. And
yeah, it does.
This is why this battle over the statues in the South are so important, because it's not about the right wing and the fascists. They always say, "Oh, you're erasing history by removing Robert E. Lee." And it's like, no. We want to know the history of Robert E. Lee so we can make sure a person like that never emerges with that much power again. It's not about erasing history. It's about what kind of history, what kind of South are we choosing to honor and remember?
Yeah, and there's also, I mean, we're talking about these sacred spaces, and Mike, I agree with you. I mean, I spoke as eloquent as I could about the need for sacred spaces. I would love, however, to move on from sacred spaces, to move on from the idea that we can put up anything in marble and it lasts forever, because it always is the thing that's going to determine the value of that spot. But as long as we're fighting this war over history, we need to have our own monuments. There is a man, his name is Kirk Savage. He's a friend of mine. He teaches at the University of Pittsburgh, and he's been working on the National Mall, first as a scholar and now also working with the National Mall. And he's gotten a lot of energy behind temporary monuments. So if the old narrative is like, here's, a marble, well, I mean, look, those shitty statues in the South, they're not marble. here's a limestone or even concrete statue of Robert E. Lee, and then we'll tear it down and we'll put Frederick Douglass up, or we'll put Sojourner Truth up. Fuck that. Let's put Frederick Douglass up, but put it up in wood or paper mache or something, and enjoy it for a year or 6 months. And then you put Sojourner Truth up later. And so you don't have this space that is forever beyond contention. Oh, for 100 years, Robert E. Lee ruled here, and we finally tore him down and put up a new ruler, and it is Frederick Douglass. The community is always constantly engaged in what the next person, or not even necessarily a person, symbol, anything is going to go in that space. And that puts the politics back into the politics of memory, instead of just this, like, there's one thing and now it cannot be questioned. Because if we put Frederick Douglass up, or whoever, they're going to tear it down in 100 years, because history is this living, breathing process. So let's build that into it. But if we've got these sacred spaces where people gave their lives that are not being remembered at all, I'm ready to put the marble there for now, and then we can tear that down in 200 years when the struggle is over, but not until then. At least that's my vision.
Right on.
Yeah.
Down with the vision.
Yeah, I'll send you guys Kirk Savage's work, because since you live in DC, I think you'll find it interesting. Okay, before I let you go, I just want to check if there's one more thing that you think that we didn't talk about, that people, if they go to Barcelona, they should see. Las Ramblas, Montjuic, CNT. You mentioned the telephone station. I think we hit the big ones.
I mean, you got to eat some Manchego cheese. Over the course of years. And just some advice: don't try to smuggle it out of the country, because they will preserve their manchego at all costs. But my advice also is there are tons of touristy restaurants, but the food in Barcelona is so amazing. It's all delicious. Go to some places that are off the beaten path, that just, basically serve the seafood while it's practically flopping around. I'll just say, I don't know if I want to do it again anytime soon, but it's a hell of an experience.
Yeah, I'll say that it was interesting because we kind of slapped together our trip very quick, and I'm almost embarrassed to say that we used an Airbnb, and then actually see when we're there, feeling weird about seeing actually big anti-Airbnb campaigns going on in the neighborhoods, and like, oh geez, maybe I should give like a solidarity donation because I took the shortcut on this thing. But like the idea of part of radical tourism, and I wish I had done more of this, is also part of like doing ethical tourism and try to figure out what that looks like. I think I'm embarrassed to say that I didn't. We did find some local leftists. We did try to support local stores and organizations, and we did we did what we could, but giving some mind to how to do that, how to not. I mean, sadly, the left's numbers really aren't really the pivot here. But still, I think it's important to be mindful of that tourism can be done ethically, and figuring out how to do that.
Leave light footprints, as
Yeah.
we say, in the art of cross-cultural communication.
If you're following this at all, Barcelona has been, the pandemic changed everything, but it's been in a crisis point. It has too many tourists, hence the anti-Airbnb stuff. But it's not true that Barcelona has too many tourists. The city depends on tourism. They have too many asshole tourists who do it the wrong way, who only go to the Ramblas, who don't learn the culture of the city, and who don't. If you are in Barcelona, talking to people about this, learning a few phrases in Catalan, seeing the places that aren't on the list, you will be welcome. You will be beloved. I have experienced it. So they don't want no more tourists in Barcelona, but they want you there with a sense of appreciation and engagement. And man, if you're at the point of listening to a podcast like this and reading George Orwell, you're doing what you need to do. And then all the environmental footprint stuff and everything, I'm afraid that is beyond the scope of this show. But boy, do we all need to work more on that.
Agree.
Well, this has been such a great opportunity because, I mean, especially like in this Omicron moment, like this idea now of travel seems so far-fetched to me. And the fact that we were able to get this in right before the break, I just feel very fortunate. I mean, because it enriched me, as travel often does.
Yeah, and I want us to push, we pushed reset on society when the pandemic happened, and now the people are just rushing to put it right back exactly the way it was, but it's time to do things differently, and we can do travel differently. I'm ready for this pandemic to be an inflection point. And also I'm ready to travel again. Although I mentioned to Dave earlier, I have a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old, so I'm not sure when I'm getting out to Barcelona anytime soon.
Right.
Yeah, I want to travel and do some state smashing.
Yeah. You can do that at home, Dave. You're in the perfect place to do some state smashing.
It's like smash your own damn state. All right, fine. Only the United States, though. Maybe I can try somewhere a little more brittle, a little more user friendly.
Yeah, it's a big task. Try taking a sledgehammer to the Washington Monument and see how that goes.
Yeah, that goes. Allow me to even walk on the grass with a sledgehammer. I wonder how close I'd get. God. Oh, well, this has been great, Graham. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. This is awesome. Thank you so much. This was a wonderful conversation.
Thanks, Graham. Be well.
Well, that was fantastic. That was as fun as a conversation about a failed revolution can be, as far as I'm concerned. I will have an episode for you about Orwell and the Spanish Civil War in not too long, sometime in 2022 anyway. Remember that this show depends on your support. You can go to everydayanarchism.com to make a financial contribution. You can also leave a review at Apple Podcasts and now on Spotify. That helps enormously. And I also love to hear from you at everydayanarchismpodcast@gmail.com. I do hope to have Dave and Mike back on the show after I have been back to Barcelona, so based on the age of my kids, you can expect Dave and Mike back on the pod in 2033, I would say. Okay, I'll see you next time. All that's left to say is that the music, which you're about to hear, is by David Hill.